welcome to Ep003 of the Liverpool Stories Podcast with me, Dale Roberts. Now, in the last episode, the question was the place where it all began. And the place we spoke about was the Carving Club, the place where it all began, the place where the motto came from, the place where it all began. Today, we're going to delve a lot deeper on the subject of the place where it all began. We're going to go even further back to the origin point of what would become the Beatles. But I'll be honest, I don't believe the question matters in the grand scheme of things. You know, I think it's actually a really good subject to try and dissect the place where it all began. But there might be a little bit of trauma in this question for me. And I explained in episode 1, in the journey to George's house, sort of my background in the tourism industry in Liverpool. I've worked in this industry for now my 10th year is what I'm going into now. And I've been a qualified tour guide for 7 years, going into my 8th year. That'll be in about April time. Over the years, I've been blessed. I started tour guiding when I was 27 years of age. And tour guiding is one thing, but tour guiding in Beatles tourism feels completely different than any kind of tour. And over the years, I've done city tours, I've done football tours. And football tours can be quite challenging and demanding. But Beatles tours are something that people are really particular about. But Beatles history is so complex in many ways. There's been so many books written about it, so many conflicting stories. And if people want to delve into these conflicting stories, all you have to do is look at songs like Day Tripper, where you get 3 legitimate reasons as to what that song might actually be about. And then you could go to Paul McCartney as reference, and you can't really get much sense from Paul McCartney because over the years, many of his stories seems to have changed, you know. And then John couldn't remember dates of certain things. And George Harrison, whenever he was asked, he didn't seem to particularly care about the particular dates and times and facts and figures, you know. And Ringo wasn't there for the origin story of the Beatles. He was there for the origin of the Merseybeat. But for the origin story of the Beatles, Ringo isn't necessarily a part of it. Now, the trauma element for me is I've never really been picked up on things. When I first started guiding, I was 27 years of age, and everybody that I'd chat to on a tour bus, like middle-aged men, for example, that seems to be the market that really always like to challenge me and question me on various things. It's funny. And I remember one of the first times I ever got really questioned on something. Someone asked me a question and I knew it. And it was by blind chance because I was petrified that I wouldn't know the answer. And I knew the answer and I was so proud of myself. But then since then, I've managed to just get lucky. I'll be honest with you. Like the questions that people ask, I tend to know the answers to. And I don't look at it like I'm some sort of, you know, genius when it comes to the story of the Beatles. There's plenty of people, even in the city of Liverpool, who would be considered historians. For me, I'm a storyteller. I tell the story. The reason why this might be a bit of a trauma question for me is the only time I've ever been corrected on a tour bus, and let's not forget, last year I guided to over 14,000 people, but the only time I've ever been properly corrected on a bus to the point of head down feeling shame was it was a good few years ago now. We were driving along Penny Lane and Colin Hanton was walking along the road. Now, Colin Hanton was the original drummer of the Quarrymen, okay? And that's what this episode's about, the Quarrymen. But Colin was walking along Penny Lane, so we pulled over the bus, and I'm proud to say I've met Colin plenty of times. I've had phone call conversations with Colin. He's a lovely, lovely man. So we pull over the bus, we open the door, I say hello to Colin, I say, would you like to get on and have a word? There was 53 people, it was a full bus. And Colin gets on the bus and he stands there, and no one on board the bus knew who he was. So I stand there and go, guys, and in me head, I still to this day just, it's something that really makes me cringe when I consider it. I stood on the mic and I said, guys, this is my friend, everyone say hello to Colin, everyone clapped. And then, stupidly, I said, Colin was in the Beatles. And he was there on the day that John Lennon first met Paul McCartney at St. Peter's Church Hall on the 6th of July 1957. And I get all excited because I am introducing Colin Hanton onto the bus. And everyone's like, wow, you know, everyone claps him again. And Colin takes the mic off me, holds it in his hand and goes, firstly, I wasn't in the Beatles, I was in the Quarrymen, and I still am in the Quarrymen. And I remember thinking, oh dear. And then he said, and also, I wasn't there in the room when John first met Paul. I was out having my lunch. And I remember the feeling of just like, oh dear, the two things I just said about this man, it just completely eradicated in front of me by the man who had first-hand witness testimony and the authority to correct me. And I remember getting back on the microphone thinking, I need to pull this back somehow. And Colin got off the bus and went, well, he was featured on the Beatles anthology album, so he was a Beatle in my eyes, and I kind of brushed over it. But I remember the embarrassment I felt. Unfortunately, none of the guests came over to me thinking I was someone who didn't know anything. They still respected me, I think, I hope. But for me, it was a shameful moment. But it also generated a thought within my brain, though, at that time of, for me, I've always just had it as an interchangeable thing, the Quarrymen and the Beatles. I view both of them as hand in hand. So for me, when I see Colin Hanton, I have respect for them. I almost am like, wow, it's Colin Hanton, because he was the original drummer of the Quarrymen. I feel the same about Colin as when I've met Pete Best. And Pete Best was legitimately a Beatle, and he was the drummer of the Beatles. But I felt the same when I met Pete as when I met Colin. And maybe I'm wrong about that, but for me, they were both such an important part of the story. And I've never met Ringo, but I can guarantee I'd probably feel a lot more in awe of Ringo. And that's mainly because I've had the pleasure of meeting Pete quite a few times and Colin many times. But for me, they're all part of the origin story of the Beatles. So that's the question, and it's something that other people might want to discuss and debate. Where does it begin? Does it begin at the Quarrymen? Because for me, I have always said on tour buses, it begins with the Quarrymen. It begins with John Lennon's first band, the Quarrymen. But it actually goes further back than that. Before they were the Quarrymen, John Lennon is sat in his school and he sets up his band with the original name, the Blackjacks. And it's considered that they were the Blackjacks for about a week. And John Lennon was, of course, the front man. And the only other person that we can definitively say was a member of the Blackjacks was Pete Shotton. The problem with the origin story of the Beatles is we are relying on the thoughts and memories of boys who were about 15, 16 years of age at the time, getting asked these questions as adults. Now, for me, I am 34, and if someone asked me, what were you doing at 15 years of age? I know I was playing football quite a lot when I was 15. But if someone said, do you remember this game? Do you remember who you were playing against? And do you remember the starting lineup of the team? I wouldn't remember anything. I wouldn't even remember the score. I would remember very small details. So when we talk about the origin story of the Beatles and the Quarrymen, we're talking about history from a long time ago that's remembered in retrospect. So this gets incredibly convoluted, incredibly complex, and I'm pretty positive that people will disagree even with my sort of premise and my arguments that I put forward for the origin story and the place where it all began for the Quarrymen. Okay, so let's go to the real origin site of the Beatles. You see, rock and roll is taking the world by storm. Rock and roll begins in the United States of America, in the suburbs, the black suburbs of the United States. And then it's taken by those white artists like Elvis and Buddy Holly, and it's projected into the mainstream. You know, people bring the origin to Bill Haley in the comments with Rock Around the Clock for rock and roll itself hitting the mainstream and the white kids going crazy for it. But it begins even further back than that. It begins in the black suburbs of the United States of America. But here in the UK, black American rock and roll music isn't getting played on the radio. In fact, even Elvis and Buddy Holly are going to struggle to get airtime in UK radio. So the kids are listening to pirate radio station in the United Kingdom, Radio Luxembourg and things like that. And the kids are able to get their hands on records by a man called Lonnie Donegan. And Lonnie Donegan's really the godfather of the entire UK rock and roll movement. But he is, of course, the godfather of skiffle music. Skiffle finds its origins in jazz music, you know, and in the UK they estimate that there could have potentially been over 30,000 skiffle bands in this country in the 1950s, and lots of them were found on Merseyside because the kids were taken to skiffle music to replicate rock and roll. It was cheap. Skiffle was played with household objects like pots and pans, bits of string, kitchen utensils and washboards. So everyone wants to be in a skiffle band. And that was certainly the case for a group of lads in Quarrybank High School. So all of a sudden, the lads in the school are having a conversation about it. They want to set up a band, so they do. They call themselves the Blackjacks for about a week. And then they change the... Snoop, what are you doing? You having a growl, are you? They become the Quarrymen, named after their school, Quarrybank High School. The Quarrymen would go on to have about 15 members in the band eventually. So the Quarrymen are the real origin point, but they're our skiffle band. This isn't where it all begins for that famous Beatles sound, because the Beatles were in a skiffle band. They were a solid rock and roll band and pioneers of music. But where it actually begins for them is playing with pots and pans and washboards and, and guitars that were guaranteed not to split, very cheap instruments, and John Lennon, unable to even tune up his own guitar without getting the bus and trying to find people who could do it for him. Okay, so where it begins for the Quarrymen is, of course, a Quarrybank High School, which was their high school. It was literally where these teenage lads were going to every single day. John Lennon would walk across Calderstones Park to get to Calderstones High School, and all of the lads would become obsessed with rock and roll, American rock and roll music. They were starting to comb their hair back, have teddy boy quiffs. And there was a line in their school song, Quarrymen, old before our birth. And that was the line that they would get the Quarrymen name from. Originally called the Blackjacks for 1 week. They would change their name to the Quarrymen. And then, they'd end up with about 15 members in the band. And the Quarrymen was their solid name for quite some time afterwards, But this is where it begins. They come up with the name the Quarrymen here at Quarrybank High School. That's where John Lennon went to high school. Okay, this is one of the most niche places I can possibly show you, but the earliest rehearsal space of the Quarrymen is here, number 83 Vale Road. It's the first place that the Quarrymen rehearsed, which was in Pete Shotton's old house, which runs parallel to Menlove Avenue, where John Lennon lived. So they all went round to the house. Pete Shotton's mum really didn't like the noise of them playing, so she kicked them all out to what was the corrugated shed out back. And that's where they would rehearse for the first time. And then from there, they would start rehearsing in other places further down the line. Places like John Lennon's front porch, Paul McCartney's house eventually, George Harrison's house, number 25 Upton Green in Speke. But that was the earliest rehearsal space of the Quarrymen. Okay, so the Quarrymen's first gig, it's considered to be their first gig, was on a little street in Toxteth called Roseberry Street. Now, it's considered to be their first gig. The Quarrymen themselves, according to their website, would actually claim that they had gigs before they played Roseberry Street. But the reason why it's considered to be the first gig is it's because it's the first gig that the Quarrymen were ever photographed at. They played a gig at the top end of Roseberry Street in Toxteth to the local neighbourhood who was celebrating the anniversary party of the city of Liverpool. So in essence, the coronation party for when King John had granted Liverpool its charter. So there was this big occasion in the neighbourhood, and the Quarrymen had been asked to play. And they played on what was a flatbed coal truck at the top end of Roseberry Street. And apparently, no one in the audience seemed to like it. In fact, John Lennon started to annoy the lads in the audience, and he started threatening John. So John had to run off the stage, and he hid in a member's house on Roseberry Street, a lady called Mrs. Roberts. And he hid in her house for about 2 hours until the police came and gave John Lennon and the Quarrymen an escort back to their bus stop. So John Lennon had a police escort away from his first ever gig. And I like to think that was really a sign of things to come in many ways. The Quarrymen themselves, according to their website, say that they probably had gigs before then, which would make sense. The Quarrymen were founded in what is considered to be late 1956. And then they didn't play here until the summer of 1957. So there's a very good chance that they played quite a few gigs before they even got to Roseberry Street, although it is widely considered that this is where they had their first ever gig. Toxteth is famous, by the way, these days for other reasons. By the 1980s, Toxteth would gain a lot more fame for being home to the Toxteth riots in 1981. So there's a lot of history in this neighbourhood. These days, great community of people. However, this is where it could potentially be one of many places where it all begins for the Quarrymen. Here in Toxteth in Liverpool, on Roseberry Street, on the back of a flatbed truck. Okay, so when it comes to the discussion of the place where it all began, or the birthplace of the Beatles, I mean, Quarrybank High School is one place, but let's not forget Quarrybank was not necessarily a happy place for John. John would get dreadful school reports. I actually went to Quarrybank School because my son is 12 years of age, so I was testing out if he could go there to go to high school. And I went in, and at the time I was manager of the Magical Mystery Tour, and I went over to the head teacher and I was like, I'm manager of the Magical Mystery Tour. I said, this is so cool to be here. And he went, oh yeah, because of John Lennon. And I was like, yeah, we chatted. He was a lovely fella. And he said to me, we don't really talk about John here because he wasn't that well behaved. And I was like, it's John Lennon, like this crazy. But Quarrybank, yes, it begins there for the name, the Quarrymen, okay? And that's where they start coming up with the idea, and it's where the lads are sort of wanting to be rock and roll stars. Then, potentially, at Roseberry Street, the location of what is known to be their first ever gig, that's where they're first on a stage performance, so it begins there. But if it ends there, which it easily could have, the Quarrymen would have faded into obscurity. They continue getting gigs. And then one day, 6th of July 1957, the Quarrymen get a gig at the Woolton Village Fete. And when I say a gig, they have 3 gigs. It's always commonly thought that they had 2 potentially, but the first one is that they drove around the area on the back of a flatbed truck. And it wasn't a proper gig, so they didn't have any amplification. No one could really hear it, but it was just a little bit of a happening going on in the neighbourhood. And there was pictures of them taken on the back of that truck. But then they had another gig. They got to the Woolton Village Fete. There was a stage already set up. They got on and they played. It was the first time that John played Bebop Alula on stage, and Come Go With Me by the Del Vikings. So this was a major occasion for them, and they felt like they were getting somewhere at this point, the Quarrymen. And Ivan Vaughan, by this point, is very much determined that he's not really going to be part of the band. So he brings a new friend with him to go and see this gig on the 6th of July 1957. And that lad was Paul McCartney. Paul's in attendance. He's watching John Lennon's Quarrymen on stage. He's enjoying the gig by all accounts. But after the gig, the Quarrymen had their third performance. Their third performance was in St. Peter's Church Hall. When they go into this church hall, they arrive early to set up. They get all their instruments out. They start playing. They start hanging around like teenage boys do. Colin Hanton goes home to have his lunch, of course. And Ivan Vaughan walks into the room, and he, by all accounts, shouts over to John and says, John, do you mind if I bring in my mate? What's the whole of the gig? He'd like to meet you. His name's Paul McCartney. So Paul McCartney was marched into St. Peter's Church Hall, and for the first time, John and Paul shook hands. You know, apparently the story goes that John Lennon looked at Paul and said, what did you think of the gig? And Paul, recognising John was older and he stunk of beer, Paul decided to try and act up a little bit, and he said it wasn't too bad, being cheeky to John. And that's how John read it. So John said, do you think you can do any better? Now, again, part of people's recollection, whether Paul had a guitar with him or whether somebody gave him a guitar, what we know is that the first thing Paul did before he played is he tuned up the guitar, which impressed everyone in the room because not a single lad in the Quarrymen could tune up their own guitar. Paul tuned it up. He then flipped the guitar upside down because he's famously left-handed. And then he launched into a song called 20 Flight Rock by Eddie Cochran. Paul McCartney went on to say that that was his audition for the Beatles, and John Lennon said that was the day that it all started moving. So no matter how we perceive things when it comes to the origin story of the Beatles, the day that John Lennon first met Paul McCartney is a definitive day in the entire story, not only of the Quarrymen, not only of the Beatles, but of rock and roll in general. If that day doesn't happen, if 2 teenage boys don't meet each other inside the church hall in Woolton Village, the world is not the same place. None of it happens if John and Paul don't meet each other and form the greatest songwriting partnership that the world's ever seen. See, the story of the Beatles, for me, people can nerd out on the trivia of it. And when they get older, people can look at the Beatles like they're deities and these, world-shattering characters like John Lennon, one of the most iconic figures in history. And what I love about the origin story of the Beatles is it's normal lads, These are teenage boys who have no idea what's ahead of them. And this is such an interesting thing with the origin story of the Beatles. Like the meeting of John Lennon and Paul McCartney is so immortalized that we can tell the story with glamour, and Paul tuning up the guitar, playing 20 Flight Rock. We know this because Paul McCartney said it. John Lennon says about playing Bebop and Lulu at the Woolton Village Fete, so we know that. So we know their own accounts. The rest of it is the Quarrymen, the lads who were in the room. And as I said earlier on, there was about 15 documented Quarrymen. By the time John and Paul meet each other at St. Peter's Church Hall, there is Eric Griffiths, Colin Hanton, Rod Davis, Pete Shotton, Len Gary. That's the band at that point, and John Lennon. Now, by all accounts, they didn't recruit Paul McCartney simply because he was talented. Apparently, it was more about competition. Pete Shotton would say to John Lennon, it's better to have him in our band than anyone else's because he was so good. So it made sense to get Paul in the band because they didn't want him in anyone else's because they knew it would be competition for them. So Paul would join, and John and Paul would end up having a significant amount in common eventually. Paul, not long before joining the Quarrymen, loses his mother, and then within a couple of years, John Lennon loses his. It's really the thing that cements the relationship together, and it forms one of the greatest songwriting partnerships in history. But for me, it's about young lads, young teenage boys who have no idea what's ahead of them, having a chance encounter and going on to completely change the world. Okay, this is not part of the origin story of the Beatles. Of course it isn't, but it feels wrong to be in Woolton Village and not point this out. When John and Paul first met each other, it was a chance encounter of two teenage boys. Then, years down the line, they released a song called Eleanor Rigby, and it transformed the world of popular music. It was a popular music song featuring a string quartet. Like, this is unusual for pop music. And then years after that, they discover that opposite where John and Paul first met each other, there's a gravestone to a lady called Eleanor Rigby. Paul McCartney's asked about it. He said that the lady who's buried here has nothing to do with the song at all. Okay? In fact, he actually says the original lyrics were Daisy Hawkins. That's what the song was originally entitled. And then he changed it to Eleanor Rigby because he acted with Eleanor Bron in a film called Help. And he liked a wine merchant in Bristol called Rigbys. He put both the names together and created the fictitious name Eleanor Rigby. But it does just so happen that the lady who's buried here, everything that's been researched about her seems to indicate that the song was about her. Paul says it's a very spooky coincidence. He actually says maybe the gravestone was in his subconscious memory because him and John used to hang around this neighbourhood when they became friends. So the plot thickens on that one. But John and Paul did hang around this neighbourhood together once they became friends. In fact, John Lennon was a choir boy in St. Peter's Church. John Lennon would visit this graveyard as well because his uncle George finds his resting place here. So he certainly would have been here for the funeral, and he would have came to visit his uncle George's grave. And on a complete side note, this graveyard opposite where John and Paul first met also is the final resting place of Bob Paisley, Liverpool FC's most successful ever manager and one of the most successful football managers in history. So the Quarrymen are formed. They have their first gig on Roseberry Street as a skiffle band that impress absolutely nobody and get chased off stage. Then they have a few more gigs. Then they play St. Peter's Church Hall, the Woolton Village Fete, a huge moment where John Lennon first meets Paul McCartney. But Paul doesn't join straight away. He goes off to Boy Scout camp a couple of weeks later, so he can't join the band instantly. So a bit further down the line, the lads have a gig at the new Clubmore Hall, which is a conservative club, and Paul McCartney finally joins. He has his first gig with the Quarrymen. He gets on stage with John, and it becomes obvious that Paul isn't going to be the natural guitarist that they're looking for, but he's a great addition to the band. The rest of the Quarrymen are already starting to flake and leave the group at this point, by the way. So John and Paul are having a conversation, and Paul tells him about a lad that he knows who's significantly younger than the rest of them, but this lad's a fantastic guitarist. Paul knew this lad because they got the bus together to go to school. And this lad, of course, is George Harrison. So George meets Paul McCartney on the 86 bus route. That's how Paul meets George for the first time, because they actually were neighbours. They lived around the corner from each other when Paul lived in Speke. Paul moves to Fortham Road, number 20 Fortham Road, a house that's now considered to be the most important house in the history of modern music. But it puts him on the exact same bus route that George is getting every single day to get to school. So Paul and George go to the same school together. They're in different year groups, but they get the bus together. So they're friends for that reason. But Paul knows that George is obsessed with playing the guitar, and George is a good guitarist, as we well and truly know. Even at a young age, he was shown very promising signs of being a great guitar player. So Paul tells John about him. John is certainly not impressed because of how young he is. John doesn't want him in the band. Now, this is where the history again gets a little bit sketchy and might be up for debate. You see, what happens from this moment is it could be a case of George has an audition in the morgue skiffle cellar. George Harrison's mum would say that he was first introduced to John in a fish and chip shop. It's Pete Shotton who actually claimed that they may have took all the lads, the Quarrymen, to George Harrison's house in number 25 Upton Green and Speak for George to audition in his own house for the Quarrymen. But what is universally accepted as the audition story of George Harrison is that George Harrison was sat with John and Paul on the top deck of the number 86 bus, and John asked George to play the guitar for him. George played a song called Raunchy by Bill Justice, and it'd be the song that would get George Harrison into the Quarrymen. So that's the story about how George ends up impressing John to the point where John's happy to accept George Harrison in, a lad who's 3 years younger than him, into his band. It's really uncool. But George, even then, it's kind of considered that John might not have been too keen of having George. But eventually they have their first gig together as a trio. So yeah, this is all very simple stuff. But anyone who's been on the Magical Mystery Tour with me, and as I say, I've been on the Magical Mystery Tour as a guide for many years now. Anyone who's been on a tour with me knows that I spend a lot of time talking about this bus stop, which is the weirdest thing to dedicate time to talking about. But I talk about the bus stop because this one I'm saying, the origin story of the Beatles is so important for recognising that these lads were normal human beings. Everyone's so happy to deify the Beatles, and we're always so proud, and many people are so intellectual about it, and we've got to know all the facts and figures and exactly what happened. These were normal lads riding the bus together, meeting on a bus, playing the guitars on the top deck of a bus, and auditioning for a band that were going to change the world. So from that bus stop where Paul would wait to get the bus to Penny Lane, and on this bus route where they'd travel along so George could go back to Speak, this is stuff that goes on to completely and utterly change the world. Hello. How are you, mate? Oh, cheers. Thanks, mate. See you later, bud. Oh, dearie me. But yeah, what fills me full of pride about the story is just the normality of it, how normal it all actually is, you know. It's four normal lads meeting each other on bus routes, going on to change the world. In the story of the Quarrymen, the origin story of the Quarrymen, there's about 15 different band members that you can consider to be in the Quarrymen. Even if this person was just vaguely on the fringes of the Quarrymen, they'd be considered to be members of the band. So you're talking John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Stuart Sutcliffe, Chas Newby, yeah. But you have other members of the band as well. People like Eric Griffiths, Pete Shotton, Bill Smith, also a member of the Blackjack. Then you also have Nigel Walley, Ivan Vaughan. Ivan Vaughan was legendary because it was Ivan Vaughan who introduced John Lennon to Paul McCartney. Without Ivan Vaughan, maybe this entire story doesn't happen whatsoever. You also have John Lowe, known as John Duff Lowe. He was the piano player of the band who featured in Spite of All the Danger. You also have Ken Brown. But then you also have current members of the Quarrymen. The Quarrymen still exists as a band to this very day. So you have Len Gary, who recently hasn't been in the best of health, so we wish him well, we certainly do. You have Rod Davis as well. And Rod Davis was actually, by all accounts, Rod Davis could have continued being in the Quarrymen and could have potentially have been in the Beatles too. And then you have the longest serving member of the Quarrymen, the man who was in the band for the longest stretch of time, a lovely gentleman by the name of Colin Hanton. Colin Hanton was the drummer of the Quarrymen. He again featured on the record in spite of all the danger, and he is an absolute gentleman, a legend, and he has his own book out called Prefab as well, which tells that origin story of the Quarrymen before they were even close to being known as the legends that are the Beatles. Yeah, so for John Lennon, he felt like George Harrison might cramp his style because he was far too young to be in the band. But we don't definitively know when George Harrison first had his on-stage debut for the Quarrymen. Snoop's having a nice little growl and cry. You're in pain? You trying to ruin the video? Yes, you are. Snoop. Snoop, can you be quiet? Sit down. Sit. Good boy. He's listening. That's good. But for George, he would meet John Lennon. He'd impress John as well. Paul really wanted George in the band because it would have made the band significantly better, and Paul knew that. And John also knew it, but at the end of the day, this was a rock and roll band. He didn't want someone younger. But it just so happened that Paul McCartney's cousin was getting married. Now, Paul had a very tight-knit family. Paul had already lost his mother, and so the family were really rallying around the McCartney lads because they really didn't want these lads growing up to be miserable and depressed. They wanted them to have a strong family unit around them. So Paul would spend a lot of time round at his Auntie Ginny's house. But for Paul, he gets asked to play at his cousin's wedding. His cousin's 19. They're having a reception afterwards. So they wanted Paul to play. So Paul gets his two mates in, the Quarrymen. Now, the Quarrymen, as I say, this is a load of lads who are in the band who keep on sort of chopping and changing and coming in and coming out. But for Paul's cousin's wedding, it didn't need to be a full group, and it certainly didn't need to be a drum kit as well. So John, Paul and George performed for the first ever time in number 147 Dinas Lane in Huyton in Liverpool. So the area of Huyton has a significant claim to being, again, one of many places that could be considered to be a birthplace of what would be the Beatles. Because the first time we see John, Paul and George, which is the real nucleus of the band, the first time they ever play together is in Hanton, in Dinas Lane, number 147, in Paul McCartney's Auntie Gin's house. So this place in Liverpool, Huyton, can literally be called one of the birthplaces of the Beatles, simply because we actually don't fully know where it was that John, Paul and George first were on stage. No one knows for certain. But the only thing that can point to this place as being the place where they first performed together is the fact that Mike McCartney took photos of them inside this house at the party. He took multiple photos of them playing and performing inside this house. So the first time we really get the nucleus of the Beatles, which is John, Paul and George together performing, is here. Their first booked gig as a trio in number 147 Dinas Lane in Liverpool in Huyton. This is the place where it seems most likely that John, Paul and George all played together. But there is also a bit more significance as well to it as well, because Paul McCartney would have his 21st birthday in this house in number 147 Dinas Lane, in his Auntie Gin's house. He'd have his 21st birthday party, but at this point the Beatles were becoming quite a thing, you know. So John Lennon comes to the party, of course he's there, but there's a load of other Merseybeat bands and Merseybeat legends who turn up to the party as well, including the Cavern Club's legendary DJ Bob Wooler. And the problem is Bob Wooler knew everything that was going on in the Merseybeat scene. He was very clued up. And he was also very pally with the lads. Bob Wooler had given the Beatles a huge opportunity to play at the Cavern. He was the driving force behind it. But for John, the Beatles were starting to make quite a name for themselves, and he'd just become a dad. And the second his son Julian was born, John gave Julian back to Cynthia, his wife, and said, I'm off on holiday with Brian. He went off on holiday with Brian, went on a trip to Spain with him, and came back. And then almost immediately when he came back, came to Paul McCartney's 21st birthday party. So Bob Wooler had a joke with John and said, "How was your honeymoon with Brian?" Which really offended John because of the implication that he was gay. So John beat up Bob Wooler. Now, John would later claim in an interview that it was, of course, the first bit of Beatles national press was Bob Wooler getting beaten up by John Lennon, and the headlines was John beats up a local DJ. But for John, he genuinely felt he could have killed Bob Wooler. John later claimed he hit him with a stick and kept on pounding him with it. John eventually got put on the taxi that night and sent home. You know, it seemed to be quite a disastrous night for John, and he was with Cynthia at the time as well. But you have that story of Paul's 21st birthday party. But as I say, this is also the place where they first played as a trio, John, Paul and George. If anyone wants to deny my commitment to this podcast, we got stuck in so much traffic that it's gone dark on the way to the final place that I want to talk about. But if you consider that the Quarrymen were a little band that started to sort of have the concept idea of becoming a skiffle band in 1956, and then in 1957 they get a few gigs and John Lennon meets Paul McCartney, which is a huge moment in the entire story. But early 1958, that's when George Harrison comes along. Now, George Harrison then joins the Quarrymen, and 1958 should be this great year of development where all of a sudden they go from being this little skiffle band with about 15 different members bouncing in and out throughout the time, and then all of a sudden you have a nucleus of John, Paul and George, and then everything should start to change. And it does. They start getting more gigs, they get more bookings, and then by the July of 1958 something incredible happens. They book a recording studio in Kensington in Liverpool. Now, Percy Phillips Studio can legitimately lay claim to being a birthplace of the Beatles, because if we consider the Beatles to be a stage band, then the second they play as John, Paul and George, then that's the nucleus of the band. The second they play on stage as John, Paul, George and Ringo, that's a huge moment, as we know. The second they play under the name The Beatles in the Indra Club in Hamburg, or possibly in the Jacaranda in Liverpool, these are huge moments where, you know, understandably these places can be billed as birthplaces of the Beatles, the place where it all began. So this is the house here where John, Paul, George, Colin, Hanton and John Lowe walked into, and they recorded the first ever clip that we've ever heard, first ever song we'd hear from Lennon, McCartney and Harrison. And this is here, and when you consider the studio band that the Beatles went on to become, this legitimately is the place where it all began for the Beatles as a studio band. This is the first place that they ever recorded as a trio, including Colin and John Dufflow as well. But it's an incredible piece of music history here, just in the heart of Kensington in Liverpool. The songs that they recorded was two songs. They recorded a song called In Spite of All the Danger, which was an original Harrison-McCartney composition, the first and only of its kind, by the way. It's thought that the song might have been partially written inside number 25 Upton Green and Speak. Now, because they had no idea about music rights and everything, that's probably why it was a McCartney-Harrison composition, because in reality, George did the guitar solo, so it probably just felt like the right thing to do. But it became the only McCartney-Harrison composition. The other side, the B-side, was a cover of a Buddy Holly song called That'll Be the Day. Now, they made this record, and this story's been told so often by Paul McCartney. They paid money for it. They had a shellac disc, and they gave it to John Lennon. He kept it for a week, and then after that, it went to Paul McCartney, then to George Harrison, then to Colin Hanton, and then to John Lowe. And John Lowe kept the record for about 50 odd years. You see, that was the personnel on the record. It was John, Paul, George, Colin Hanton, and John Lowe. That was the Quarrymen at that particular moment in time, and they made that record, the first record pressed by the band that would go on to become the Beatles. A proud moment for me was in 2018. I discovered that the city wasn't actually doing anything to celebrate the first time that John, Paul and George ever went on record. So I contacted a friend of mine called Mark Kenny, and we re-recorded In Spite of All the Danger, and very proud to say it's been quite a beautiful little track. And yeah, I'm proud to say it's actually went down quite well. It's had about 1.5 million hits on Spotify, something I'm incredibly proud of. But yeah, inspired by a record that the lads made here in number 38 Kensington, Liverpool. So the origin story of the Beatles is incredibly complex because there's no denying whatsoever that that is a legitimate birthplace of the Beatles. You know, the Percy Phillips Studio in Kensington in Liverpool, it's a real place where things started to happen and start to take shape, even if they had no idea how big that was going to become. The record that they made would go on to sell at auction for huge astronomical figures. You know, this was a huge moment in the story of the Beatles and the recording story of the band, you know. But the tragic part of this story is that, yes, everything was looking up for the Quarrymen. John, Paul and George, everything was looking up for them. But then 3 days after they make that record, in spite of all the danger, and they press it, John Lennon's mother, Julia, is ran over outside Mendips, outside John Lennon's childhood home. She passes away. She's ran over by an off-duty trainee policeman called Eric Clegg. And John Lennon's life's never the same again. In fact, I'd go as far as saying it was by far the single biggest thing to happen in the life of John Lennon. You know, he grew up to say he lost his mother twice, but he'd also grow up to write 3 different songs about his mother. You know, it was a real tragedy happening in the life of John Lennon. And before long, the rest of the lads were leaving the band. You know, John Lowe, you know, he was only really called in if they needed a piano player. And as for Colin Hanton, he had a huge disagreement with the lads one night and decided to not play drums again for about 50 years again. Well, about 30 to 40 years, yeah. Now, eventually, George Harrison left the Quarrymen. So this is a huge moment in the story of the band because the whole history could go one way or another at this point. George Harrison leaves the Quarrymen and he joins a band called the Les Stewart Quartet. Now, he's in this band and things are looking up for George at this point, but the problem is with the Les Stewart Quartet, they don't really have any reliable musicians who are there day and night, you know. And one day they get offered a gig, a huge gig, at the first rock and roll club that was opening in the northwest of England, a place called the Casbah Coffee Club. It was being opened by Mona Best in the basement of her house. And Mona Best, by the way, is the real mother of the Merseybeat, a huge figure in the history of Liverpool and our music scene. And Mona Best decides on the opening night to get a band in called the Les Stewart Quartet. Turns out they couldn't get enough band members. So in a rush and in a panic to get enough band members, George Harrison says to Ken Brown, who's in the Les Stewart Quartet band with him, he says, I've got some mates there who I've played with for a little while in the Quarrymen. How about we get them in? So all of a sudden, George Harrison is recruiting John and Paul to join the Les Stewart Quartet. That doesn't happen, by the way. They do get recruited, but instead of calling themselves the Les Stewart Quartet, they rightly call themselves the Quarrymen. And that becomes a huge part of the story because the Quarrymen become that band who play the Casbah Coffee Club. And the Casbah is really a place where it all begins for the Quarrymen and the Beatles. This is a real crossover venue, but we came so close to losing the Beatles, and if it wasn't for the Casbah, there's a very good chance that they never would have become the Beatles in the first place, simply because they'd pretty much disbanded as a group already at that point. So the Casbah Coffee Club is a subject for a different day. I will dedicate an entire video to talking all about the history of the Casbah Coffee Club, but this realistically marks the end of the 3rd episode of the Liverpool Stories Podcast. The place where it all began is a subject that I really want to delve deeper into in terms of going to places in Liverpool. By the way, it's not just Liverpool based. Liverpool is, of course, this place where it all began. I don't think there's any denying of that. But you also have the place where it all began as the cultural phenomenon, which between various places in Liverpool, the Ed Sullivan Show is really where this becomes a gigantic, huge happening. But you also have places like New York, of course, and you also have Hamburg. These are places where it does begin for the Beatles, especially in London as well. When they go to London and meet George Martin, that's something that really starts to take shape too. So the story of where it all began for the Beatles is something I'm going to delve in much deeper in future episodes. So keep watching, subscribe if you haven't already, and let me know what you think about this episode in the comments. But thank you very much for watching.